My name is James Padden-Rogers. I'm the Executive Director of the Cornell Brooks Tech Policy Institute. And a little about the Tech Policy Institute. We are a multidisciplinary hub for tech policy and national security research here at Cornell, working at that interface between those who work on high-tech issues and those who work at the highest levels of policy, those who are engineering the fourth industrial revolution and those who are seeking to deal with it in terms of robust policies to manage the impacts of technologies on the world we live in today. You're welcome to become part of our vibrant and growing community. Now, Amelia is part of that community. We're very, very lucky to be able to have her as one of our fellows at the Tech Policy Institute. And it's thanks to Amelia that we're having this event here today, who's put an awful lot of work into making this happen. So, Amelia, over to you.
It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Professor Ron Deibert, a renowned professor of political science, as well as the director and founder of Citizen Lab, which is based out of the University of Toronto. Under his leadership, the Citizen Lab has garnered acclaim and media attention for its groundbreaking interdisciplinary research at the intersection of digital technology, human rights, and security. Some of their most notable contributions have been their work towards exposing digital espionage, censorship, and the misuse of commercial spyware to target and monitor dissidents, activists, and other political actors. Their work has been instrumental in advocating for the protection of human rights in the digital age. Professor Deibert's accomplishments are far too numerous for me to list, but I'll quickly highlight a few. His most recent book, Reset, Reclaiming the Internet for Civil Society, was awarded the prestigious Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing in 2021. And in 2022, he was appointed Officer of the Order of Canada in recognition of his contributions to digital security and human rights. So we are honored and excited to have Professor Deibert join us today. So please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Thank you, everybody. I'm really glad to be here. I'll begin with a little opening story, which I think covers nicely some of the things that I want to talk about in my presentation to you today, including the research methodologies we use at the Citizen Lab, some of the unusual approaches that we take, the impacts of our research, and some of the tricky ethical issues. So as much as I'm going to be focusing on the substance of the research that we do, I also want to talk about how we go about doing the research. I thought it'd be of interest to this group in particular. And there's some really interesting legal, ethical issues and other extracurricular stuff that has gone on over the years. So opening story, about a year ago, actually, this person reached out to us, contacted us. It's Ahmed El-Tantawi. He's an Egyptian, former member of parliament. He announced around this time last year that he was going to run against Sisi as president. And that's something that obviously is pretty dangerous to do in a country like Egypt. He found that relatives, friends, supporters were getting arrested, harassed. And so out of an abundance of caution, he came to us at the Citizen Lab and said, hey, I want to make sure that I'm not being spied on, that my phone isn't being wiretapped. Can you guys help us? That's precisely what we do. So this is like a day in the life of the Citizen Lab. So we, with his permission, with his consent, we looked at his iPhone and we did some forensic analysis and discovered 2 years earlier in September 2021, he received this SMS message. And this was quite interesting to us because we could see part of the domain is blacked out, but we were tracking the infrastructure of a mercenary spyware company called Cytrox. They manufacture a very powerful, sophisticated hacking tool called Predator. So we could see that he was sent this message and that he actually read it. And then a few minutes later, the forensic analysis showed that Predator spyware was installed on his phone. So, wow, he was being spied on 2 years before he came to us. However, the spyware had been removed. So we thought, what do we do next? Well, how about we wiretap all of his network traffic with his consent, of course. So we set him up on a VPN that routed all of his internet traffic through the Citizen Lab servers, and our analysts could see everything that he was doing. And eventually he visited a website for a progressive Egyptian newspaper that was not properly secured. It was HTTP instead of HTTPS. And when that happened, we could see in the network traffic data that we were monitoring that actually he wasn't visiting the site at all. He was redirected to this other site. We redacted part of the domain there, and we could see that the redirection happened in the logs. We could tell via something called a middle box. That's something we're really interested in the Citizen Lab. The middle box is typically a piece of equipment that's installed in an internet service provider or a telecommunications facility to monitor or interfere with network traffic as it's happening. It can be used for very benign things like quality of service to make sure your Netflix packets are moving fast, but it can also be used for censorship, or in this case, to actually redirect them to a website to actually implant spyware on his phone. So we intercepted this attack on his device in the middle of what was happening. And we were really interested in this middle box. One of the things we like to do is actually attribute or positively identify what equipment is being used. Often it's a company, maybe a Western company, and that's a significant human rights issue if those companies are supplying technology to a country like Egypt where it's going to be used to do something like this. So we said, let's take a look at this middle box. And what we could see, interestingly, when we did some network mapping, is that this spyware injection middle box was within Egyptian telecommunications space. So we knew that this was something that was happening inside domestically the jurisdiction of Egypt, which was quite interesting. But we went further. We could actually identify the equipment that was being used to do this type of spyware injection. And the reason that we could is because a few years earlier, we'd actually purchased, to do some experiments and develop our own fingerprints, a deep packet inspection box from a company called Sandvine, Procera Sandvine, one of their packet logic devices. We actually purchased this secondhand off of eBay. And when it arrived, you can see the password for it was taped to the front, which is very convenient. So we spent some time and we reverse engineered how it all worked, and we developed a unique fingerprint for Sandvine equipment that we could use for network scanning. So that was really interesting. But not only that, interesting for us in Canada was that Sandvine is actually headquartered not very far from the University of Toronto, Waterloo, Ontario. That was pretty interesting. So, hey, Canadian technology is being used in Egypt to redirect an Egyptian opposition's network web requests and implant spyware on his phone. That's pretty significant. But that wasn't the end of the story. We were actually able to capture the exploits that were used to crack open his iPhone and implant the spyware on his phone. That's very rare. That's a very sophisticated product. Manufacturers of spyware go to great lengths to kind of hide their tracks around that. And we were able to actually acquire that because we were watching as it happened in real time. We got the blueprints for this exploit. It was what's known as a 0-day. That's a software flaw that the tech platforms or the software companies are not yet aware of. And in this case, it was a 0-day against Apple products. So we worked with Google's threat analysis group, their high-end kind of threats group, and we analyzed this and we did a responsible disclosure to Apple, and they pushed out an emergency security update very quickly, actually, for all macOS, watchOS, all of Apple's products. So that was a big victory for us. Put it in some perspective how valuable those exploits are. This is a tweet from a 0-day vendor called Operation Zero, and here they're advertising for an iOS exploit of the type that we discovered. The market value is around $20 million in 2023. So that's a very lucrative finding for us. Now, interestingly, there were some impacts after this research. After we published, the Department of Treasury actually put the company that is behind this spyware, Intellexa, they're the consortium that owns Cytrox, which makes the Predator spyware, on a sanctions list. So that was a pretty big impact for us, but it didn't stop there. They added Sandvine to the designated entity list as well, which is a pretty embarrassing slap for a Canadian firm. The United States is our biggest trading partner. There's a little sweet justice for us in this story. I'll tell you a bit later on. I saw this just yesterday, actually. I was commenting, Sandvine is now pretty much going out of business. They're engaged in major layoffs. So they're in what I call the find out phase right now. This sort of thing. And really, it's kind of not just Sandvine's fault. We've been advocating for many years that the Canadian government should have in place export controls around this type of very powerful technology and haven't done so. So I think in part of the story here is it's the Canadian government's fault. So what do we have in this one case? Well, we uncovered an Egyptian espionage operation, a domestic espionage operation targeting an opposition presidential candidate. That's pretty significant. We identified the Canadian technology that's implicated, and they ended up being sanctioned by the United States. We captured the zero-day exploits that were targeting all Apple products, disarmed the mercenary spyware firm, cost them about $20 million, and triggered US sanctions against that firm. We did a responsible disclosure to Apple. They pushed out an emergency security patch affecting 1.6 billion users, including everyone in this room who is an Apple user. You would have got that. I hope you would have updated your phones last year to get that security patch. So that's, kind of a day in the life of the Citizen Lab about a year ago from today. So who are we? Let me tell you who we are, because it's an unusual group, especially for a university-based research group. This is what we do. So our focus, as Amelia said, we focus on digital security issues that arise out of human rights concerns. I founded the Citizen Lab back in 2001. So we've been doing this type of work for about over 20 years. And it's really the approach that we take that is quite unique. So we are truly an interdisciplinary research group. You hear interdisciplinarity talked a lot about in university contexts. It's getting better. I think you see more centers that are truly doing interdisciplinary work, and we've been doing it for a long time. So I'm a political scientist by background. International relations is my area of expertise. However, many of the people who work at the Citizen Lab, as you can imagine from that story, have expertise in computer science, engineering science. We especially leverage people who are lawyers, trained in law, as you'll see in a few minutes why that's important for us. And we've gotten very, very good at forensic science lately. This is very important for especially the area that I'm going to talk about today, targeted digital threats and transnational repression. And our mission, we see ourselves as doing this kind of digital accountability research. So we're a watchdog. We're independent from all governments and companies. We wouldn't take money for our research from any government or any company. And we truly see our radar as 360 degrees. When I set up the Citizen Lab back in 2001, it was actually a project. In the proposal to the Ford Foundation, I described my vision of creating this center that would do, I call it counterintelligence for civil society. And there's an old adage that comes to mind now: careful what you wish for, as you'll see. I think that's what we're truly doing now. So it is an unusual place in terms of the type of research that we do, the ethical issues involved in the research, the methodologies, and the impacts and some of the risks, especially, which I'll be going through. So the area I want to talk about, we work in a number of different areas, a lot on internet censorship. We do qualitative research, but I want to focus in particular on what we call targeted threats, which is digital espionage against civil society and digital transnational repression, which some of you in the room have been reading about. I really enjoyed the comments, by the way. I thought they're spot on. And of course, given that digital is the focus of the lab, we're interested in the surveillance industry. So I just want to spend a minute here going through how I see the surveillance industry, which is the commercial marketplace for the tools that are provided to governments, to law enforcement, to intelligence agencies to do whatever they want to do. And I envision it as kind of like this inverted pyramid. So at the high end, you have what I think of as data analytics. And this is actually an area that I'm really interested in these days. Advertising intelligence, social media analytics, what is referred to as OSINT, open source information gathering or intelligence. All of this is now marketable. There are a bunch of firms that are emerging in this space that essentially take the digital exhaust of social media and turn it into an intelligence product. Isn't it one example? This is a firm called Aspectum and Perdicio. They market foot traffic data. So this is the type of thing you'd see an advertiser being interested. Where are people walking? You know, what can we sell them as they go about their day-to-day work? Now, a lot of these companies are marketing to two different types of clients, to other advertisers, to firms that want to market their stuff, and then to law enforcement and intelligence agencies. I like this particular firm because in their use cases, they have disaster mapping, forest wildfires mapping, but social unrest monitoring. That looks a little odd, doesn't it? So that's data analytics, and there's a lot going on there. In the middle, I call it network traffic monitoring. This is among the oldest types of digital surveillance, telecommunications surveillance that happens at the network traffic layer. And a good example of that is the spyware injection middle box. It sits in the telecommunications or internet service provider facilities. It's actually a box, that Procera Sandline box. It's watching network traffic as it goes back and forth. Also in this category, I think an area that's really overlooked. Most people that I talk to about this subject seem to not be aware that this is going on. There are huge insecurities around international data roaming. So when you travel with your phone and you land in a foreign country, you know, you get that little message, welcome to Germany, you're now roaming on Deutsche Telekom. Behind the scenes, there are all sorts of protocols that are mostly used for billing between telecommunications carriers. You know, is this your customer? Yes. What's his SIM number? Here it is. Okay, who's going to handle the billing? All of that stuff happens behind the scenes. Well, there are firms that have been established that actually have gotten licenses to operate as telecommunications carriers and join this club and offer that particular tracking service to government clients. A whistleblower who used to work in this industry now works for me full-time in the Citizen Lab, and he brought with him some data. Just to give you one snapshot of some of the findings here that are pretty terrifying. We've discovered Saudi Arabia made millions of location tracking requests of Saudi users as they were traveling in the United States in a 4-month period. Right? So this is a regime that has a long-standing practice of digital transnational oppression, including targeted murder. So to be able to identify exactly where someone is at any one point in time is a pretty dangerous thing. Here's one of these firms, Circles. This is from a Citizen Lab project a few years ago. This type of service that they're providing doesn't really leave a trace that you can pick up. However, what we found in this project was that the Circles, when they set up their infrastructure for government clients, they used a particular firewall, a checkpoint firewall, that had a unique fingerprint that we could isolate. So we scanned the entire internet, billions of internet connected devices, to triangulate down to those particular fingerprints on the internet, and we could positively identify all of Circle's government clients. Now, when you look at them, it's some of them are liberal democratic countries like Australia, but a lot of them are countries that are likely going to use that type of capability. Here's another firm in this category, now defunct, another Israeli firm. There are a lot of Israeli firms in this area. There's a story behind that I can tell later on in the Q&A if you want. This company is changed names. That's very common, by the way. Some go up, some go down, they rebrand, whatever. For a while it was called Ability. But I like to point this out because they have the creepiest slogan. All others talk, we listen. Definitely true. And then down at the bottom, mostly what I'm going to be talking about, what we've been I think it's fair to say pioneering research in this area around targeted spyware. So this is, you all know about malware and viruses and so on. This is high-end mercenary spyware, usually produced by companies that are made up of veterans of intelligence agencies now working in the private sector, enabling their government clients to get inside someone's phone, either an Android or an iPhone. And why is that valuable? Well, when you get inside someone's phone, you get an entire picture of their life and all of their habits, all of their social relationships, all of their movements. You get access to their GPS, obviously, all of their text messages. Importantly, even those that are end-to-end encrypted. In fact, encryption is a driving force for this marketplace, right? As more stuff becomes end-to-end encrypted, the way to defeat that is you get inside the device. Because once you're inside the device, you see everything that the user sees. You see messages before they're encrypted and when they're decrypted, when you receive them. So this is a big deal. And as you'll see, I hope from my presentation, widely abused by governments around the world because it's operating in a largely unregulated sphere up until recently. A few words about our methodologies at the lab. So as I mentioned, we use interdisciplinary approaches in our investigations. We rely a lot on technical methods that mostly come from computer science, engineering science, a lot of forensic analysis, a lot of network scanning. Really interesting. One of the things I've learned over the last couple of decades is how much you can actually discover on the basis of computers talking to each other over the internet. It's like a two-way street. So if you know what to look for, you can scan the internet and interrogate computers that are connected to the internet to see how they respond in a particular way. We do a lot of work with human subjects, victims, survivors, whatever you want to call them, in two different ways. One is do a lot of forensic analysis on devices, and we've gotten really good at that. We have a good team who does that. But also you want to talk to these people. That's where the qualitative research comes in. You find out a lot about their experiences, the harms that they experience as a result of being victimized in this way. For example, there's a major gender dimension to digital transnational repression. Women are targeted differently than men and are subjected to different forms of harassment. So there are lots of things you find out when you speak to victims and you do it systematically as a project. We have a big study coming out on the gender dimension of digital transnational repression in a couple of months. All of this is governed under strict research ethics protocols, which distinguishes the Citizen Lab from some of the NGOs that do similar work to what the Citizen Lab does, like Amnesty International or Access Now. We collaborate with them a lot, but being based at the University of Toronto, everything that we do has to be governed by research ethics protocols, and that's a very good thing. I'll talk about that why in a few minutes. And then we do a lot of OSINT ourselves. It's surprising how much you can find just on LinkedIn, for example. People like to brag on their resumes. And it's like, oh, that's interesting. You work for that company. Now you work over here, and I can see on your resume you're bragging about something. Like all of that stuff informs the research that we do. So I want to walk through several case studies and show slightly different illustrations, stories about some of the victims and some of the approaches that we have taken to the research over the last 20 years or so. This is one of the most important. So back in 2016, this person, Ahmad Mansour, is a human rights defender in the UAE. He received these two unsolicited text messages on his iPhone. And he's quite savvy. He had been targeted many times before. When he received those messages, he didn't click on them. For those of you who can read Arabic, it has to do with torture in Emirati prisons. So it's the type of thing that he might be enticed to click on, and that's precisely what they hope to do. Click on that SMS message and it would implant spyware on his phone. He didn't do that. Instead, he forwarded them to us at the Citizen Lab for analysis. And we were able, once again, to capture the exploits that were being used in this instance to load a different type of spyware on his phone than Predator, the one I talked about before. And this one was very sophisticated. It was an exploit chain of 3 separate Apple 0 days. So you remember one worth 20 million? Back then, I think they were worth about $1 million in 2016. So still a big deal. And had he clicked on those links, the operators would have been able to, this is from marketing brochures from Pegasus spyware. They would have been able to listen in on all of his phone calls. They would have been able to turn on the camera, activate the microphone. So if you think about it, say, I'm a spy and I'm interested in what's going on in this room. We're having a private meeting. We're part of the opposition and authoritarian context, or maybe we're even abroad in a country we think is safe, but we're meeting to talk about how we want to strategize. If I just can manage to hack into one person's phone, I can turn on the microphone, I can hear everything in the room, right? So it's very effective. I think somebody made a comment earlier about how this is now, a capability that before, I think it was you about, you have to send a police officer to put a bug in a lampshade or something, right? Well, now you have a spy in the pocket, right? So when the CEOs or the people who work for the companies or their lawyers defend what they're doing or justify what they're doing, this is a common refrain. If you're a criminal, don't be afraid. We only sell to legitimate government, law enforcement, or intelligence agencies to do what they do. We're following local laws. That's definitely true, but I think it's political science 101. Say, what's a criminal? Who's a terrorist? It's all in the eye of the beholder. And that's the big problem with this industry, that these companies are justifying what they're doing. They're in it for the money. They undertake virtually no due diligence. And the governments to whom they sell end up using it against people like Ahmad Mansour. After we did the responsible disclosure on this report and captured Pegasus spyware manufactured by NSO Group, there was a sad coda to the story, which was Ahmad Mansour was arrested, and he is currently in solitary confinement in prison as we speak, now close to 10 years later, for his social media posts, which were deemed insulting to the regime. So that in the UAE, that's a criminal, that's a terrorist, someone like Ahmad Mansour. Obviously a big problem. Now, as we were analyzing the infrastructure of NSO Group back in 2016, after we published the results of that case, we noticed we were scanning the internet, looking at social media, and we came across a couple of tweets from this Mexican journalist, Rafael Cabrera. He said, hey, I'm getting these unsolicited texts. I don't know who this is. And actually the television station that purportedly sent him the tweets said, that's not us. We don't know who that is. Those are phony. So he thought, something's going on in Mexico related to NSO Group and Pegasus. So it was interesting because this Mexican journalist was actually at that time when he received those texts, doing investigative journalism around corruption at the highest levels of the Mexican government. So he's obviously an important target. What we did is we reached out to this guy, Luis Fernando Garcia, who works for an organization called R3D. And we explained to him, we said, look, Luis, we suspect that the Mexican government is using Pegasus spyware. The way that we can investigate this is, with your help, go to your communities and try to figure out who would be most likely targets, journalists, activists, whatever. With their consent, look through their SMS history, and we developed a scanning tool. And it wasn't long before Luis said, Islam, I think I have some targets. So among them was this person, Javier Hardenas. So Javier is an investigative journalist in Mexico. It's one of the most dangerous places in the world to be an investigative journalist. And he covered both state corruption and the drug cartels. That's like a bad mix, right? Right off the bat. Unfortunately, he met a sad ending. He was gunned down in the streets of the city in which he lives, Culiacan. And there you can see his wife grieving in the background. We discovered that shortly after he was murdered, his colleague and editor at the newspaper in which he worked received an unsolicited text message, which we confirmed contained an NSO exploit link. So somebody was trying to hack the phone of his editor after this murder took place, which makes you wonder the motivation of whoever it is that's operating the spyware. And then a few days later, his wife, Griselda, also received several of these text messages. And you can see that at this time, the spyware relied on some type of victim interaction. They needed to trick somebody into clicking on a link, which would activate the exploit. As I'll explain in a few minutes, that's no longer necessary in the latest versions of Pegasus spyware. You don't need any victim interaction at all, which is very scary. But back then it was kind of like their Achilles heel because we're tracking their infrastructure. We could see these exploit links positively confirm these people were being targeted. So we did this over 2017 and 2018, worked closely with New York Times journalists. And actually, this is something I'm quite proud of, actually. In one calendar year, 2017, we had 4 of our reports covered separately on the front pages of the New York Times. That's a pretty big deal in terms of, visibility for your research. We were quite happy about that. But as I'll talk about a bit later, unfortunately, it hasn't made much of a difference in Mexico. So publicity is nice, but it doesn't always help when it comes to impacts that you want. I'm going to talk about another victim now, but the way I want to get there is by explaining a bit about how we do this network monitoring for the infrastructure of some of these spyware firms. And in doing so, I want to talk to you about the widening proliferation that we're seeing of this type of technology. So in the course of doing this research, as I mentioned a couple of times, we've been able to capture the spyware, reverse engineer it, understand how it communicates. So when a government operator uses this type of spyware to hack into one of your phones, the data that they're collecting has to travel somewhere over the internet to command and control servers that the company operates for the government clients. And those command and control servers communicate in very specific ways. So over the years, we've developed fingerprints for some of these major mercenary spyware vendors, and we've been able to actually determine who their government clients are. So the first time we did this was back in 2014 with an Italian mercenary spyware vendor that's now gone out of business called Hacking Team. And you can see here the roster of its government's clients. Again, it's a pretty disturbing picture if you're thinking about this from a human rights perspective or rule of law. Most of these governments are going to abuse that technology and go after civil society. A year later, we did a similar thing with a company called Gamma Group that markets a spyware product called FinFisher. And you can see here, again, pretty disturbing picture of proliferation of this type of technology worldwide. This is a really interesting story. There's a company called Cyberbit. Back in 2016, 2017, we discovered that in their own infrastructure that we were monitoring, they left a directory on one of their servers open. You could just browse it. They didn't have it password protected at all. And within that directory were meticulous files organized very properly of all of the infected devices that their government clients were hacking. And also included in that directory, remarkably, was a demonstration laptop that they would use when they would try to go around the world selling their technology to prospective government clients. So we watched for a year as Cyberbit employees traveled around the world. We could see, based on this directory that was being updated, exactly where they were. And then we would do some OSINT and figure out, okay, that IP address is connected to this hotel. We could see things like, for example, this little call out box is hilarious. So these people arrive at the Radisson Blu in Tashkent. And you think about it from your own perspective. If any of you have been in this situation, you get to the hotel, late at night, you want to open your laptop, make sure your presentation is okay. Next morning, you wake up, you have breakfast, do it again. Well, then you travel to demo day one, National Security Service in Uzbekistan. Not a very nice place when it comes to human rights, Uzbekistan. So we can see them traveling around. Some highlights: Office of the President, Philippines, Zambia, Rwanda, Nigeria, Vietnam, and so forth. This was a very important map that we did for NSO group. What you're seeing here is actually a bit of the reverse. So this is not a map of government clients. In this case, we were able to determine all of the countries within which devices were being hacked, and we could enumerate them. This was a big deal for us because we could see, okay, these are where all the Pegasus infections in the world are happening. This is back in 2018. And when we did this, one really stood out for us. This is a map of all of the infected devices that we were able to infer were being hacked by Saudi Arabia. We gave Saudi Arabia the codename Kingdom. We have code names for all of the governments. So this was the Kingdom operator. And as you can see, there are a bunch of hacked devices in Saudi Arabia, some other in the Middle East, but oh, Canada. That's interesting because that's where we're from. I wonder who Saudi Arabia is hacking in Canada, we asked ourselves. Now, this was in the summer of 2018. Back then, Canada and Saudi Arabia were in the midst of a major diplomatic dispute. So our Prime Minister and our Foreign Affairs Minister criticized Saudi Arabia for its human rights record. Saudi Arabia retaliated. They froze diplomatic relations. They stopped student transfers. They issued some tweets and so on. So it was a pretty hot time. And we were literally like, had this information. Somebody's device is hacked in Canada. Who can it be? All we had to go on was the IP address of the hacked device, which we could see from our network traffic analysis, would check in pretty consistently at the same time in the day from a commercial ISP in the Sherbrooke, Quebec area, and then in the evening consistently from a university network. So whoever this poor hacked person was, they were in daytime at home, and then they would be at the university in the evening. And it was somewhere around McGill, Bishop's University, Sherbrooke, Quebec, around there. So we drew up a short list, and one of our researchers actually went door to door, introduced himself and said, I'm with the Citizen Lab, here's what I'm trying to do. And with their consent, we'd look through their SMS history, and we found our needle in the haystack. It was this person, Omar Abdulaziz. So he's a Canadian permanent resident. He came to study from Saudi Arabia in Canada around 2011, I think, got permanent residency in 2014. After the Arab Spring, he became very outspoken about Saudi Arabia's human rights record. He started a YouTube show that has like 1 million subscribers, kind of a funny guy. It's like the Colbert Report of Saudi Arabia. Anyway, when we met him, we explained who we are, said, can we look through your SMS history? Sure enough, on one particular day, he received this SMS message, and we could see from this domain that was a Pegasus link that we were aware of. What he had done actually was he likes to work out in the gym, and he had ordered protein powder on Amazon. Then came this SMS message, coincidentally. He thought it had something to do with it, and he recalls clicking on that link. That activated the spyware. So we did up a report on this, published it October 1st, 2018. The very next day, Omar texted me and said, I'm very afraid Jamal has gone missing. I'm like, who's Jamal? I had no idea what he was talking about. Well, it turns out that Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post journalist who was executed by Saudi Arabia in Turkey, and Omar Abdulaziz were very close friends. Not only that, they have been communicating privately over WhatsApp messages, here are a couple of them, activism against the Saudi regime. And you can see here, what they're talking about is pretty provocative stuff if you're looking at it from the perspective of Saudi Arabia. Now, what they didn't know is the whole time they were doing this, Omar's device had been hacked, as we had shown, and Saudi authorities were basically listening in to all of those calls. And it's quite likely that that precipitated what happened next, which was, of course, the execution of Jamal in Turkey. So that was a pretty wild experience, being involved in that. Subsequently, we showed that several of Jamal's relatives, close friends, also had their phones hacked. Now, NSO Group, when confronted about this, actually on 60 Minutes, they said, we've checked, there's no way that Jamal Khashoggi's device was hacked. We don't know for sure what happened because his fiance gave his devices to Turkish intelligence, right, to Turkish police. But we do know that everybody around Jamal Khashoggi had their phones hacked. So it's very disingenuous for NSO Group to say this. Last victim I want to talk about is this person, Loujain Al-Hotoul. How many people have heard of her? So you may know once I explain a bit, she's an advocate in Saudi Arabia for a woman's right to drive a car. There's a whole guardianship system in Saudi Arabia. She's very outspoken about it, and unfortunately has faced enormous persecution, torture in prison. Right now, she's under countrywide arrest. She can't leave Saudi Arabia. Anyway, a few years ago, after she was detained for 3 years in prison and horribly tortured, when she got out, she was worried about her phone. She reached out to us. We did an analysis of her phone and discovered that it was hacked with the latest version of Pegasus at that time that required no interaction, no need to trick her onto clicking on a link. It's known as a zero-click version of the spyware. And in this case, once again, we were able to actually capture the exploits, and we did a responsible disclosure to Apple again, which resulted in yet another emergency security patch. But most interesting part of this story is what happened afterwards. Apple kind of freaked out. It was unexpected. So Apple announced, first of all, that they were going to sue NSO Group, and that litigation is proceeding in California court right now. They donated $10 million to support cybersecurity research of the sort that the Citizen Lab does. And quite wisely, this was my suggestion, give it to a third party because none of us could take money from Apple directly. So there's a fund that's set up by the Ford Foundation that, as we speak, is seeding research in this area. And if you're interested, you could apply to that fund. They introduced new security features, something called lockdown mode, which I have on my iPhone all the time. We've yet to see any spyware defeat a phone with lockdown mode activated. It reduces the functionality a bit, but it protects high-risk users. As you can see here, they attributed the discovery of this exploit to us at the University of Toronto. So that's a pretty big deal. Now, the other thing they did that was a really big deal, unprecedented really, is they started notifying victims of hacking that they could observe. So companies like Apple, companies like Google, they can see a lot that's going on, but for various reasons, they may not always want to disclose that. So Apple started sending out these alerts that go out in waves. We don't hear about them in advance. We hear about them as they happen, but it's like they're shaking a tree and apples are falling on the ground of all of these unwitting victims who eventually make their way to Access Now or the Citizen Lab. And ever since this started back in fall 2021, we've had these mega cases, I would call them, like El Salvador, for example. A bunch of journalists received Apple notifications, and we then followed up and did investigations and found 35 victims in El Salvador. So we've done a bunch of cases like that. It's a big step for the company. Just want to talk quickly about some real world impacts of this research, some good, some not so good, I would say. We've had numerous national scandals precipitated by our research, some in Europe. We uncovered a massive domestic espionage operation targeting Catalan civil society, including the sitting Catalan president and the 3 former Catalan presidents. It sparked a major controversy in Spain. The head of intelligence was sacked. In fact, I came back to Spain on the very day she was sacked, and there I am with one of my researchers holding up the paper. It was quite surreal to fly into the country when that happened. In Greece, similar thing. We uncovered the Greek's Watergate. Found out that the Greek government was spying on journalists and opposition politicians. And again, there, the head of intelligence was sacked after our research was published. In Mexico, not such a encouraging story, unfortunately. We've had dozens of victims that we've identified: journalists, activists, human rights defenders, opposition politicians. And even in this particular case, the evidence is it's proof positive that the Mexican army was actually using Pegasus spyware and spying on journalists and human rights defenders. But AMLO has been pretty, unwilling to admit that there's anything wrong. In fact, he said our report is made up, as you can see there, which is, I guess he didn't read it. There's lots of, it was not me. Poland, interesting story. Back in 2021, we discovered that the lawyer for former President Donald Tusk, his phone was hacked. Then you had an election. Lo and behold, Donald Tusk is in power. And his government has initiated all sorts of investigations, unearthed contracts with the prior government. As many as 600 people were hacked in Poland using Pegasus spyware. By far, the biggest impacts for us around law and policy have been in the United States. So the Biden administration has really got activated about this issue. President Biden signed an executive order which prohibits U.S. federal agencies from purchasing spyware from firms that have been implicated in human rights abuses. So NSO Group, Intellexa, they're on that list. They've also sanctioned a lot of these companies, even individual sanctions, which I think are the most painful and very important, because individuals move from one company to another, or the companies fold and then they set up shop somewhere else. So it's a big deal. It's kind of joking here, no Disneyland for you, but it's a big deal to be slapped with a personal sanction. So that's encouraging. There's been a lot of litigation. Omar Abdulaziz is suing NSO Group. Amnesty International is suing NSO Group. Apple suing NSO Group. WhatsApp suing NSO Group. So a lot of litigation has been going on, precipitated by our research. It's a bit of a double-edged sword. I'll say something about that in a minute. But I think the biggest impacts by far in terms of practical impacts have been the responsible disclosures that we have done over the last few years, which in terms of individual users is really remarkable. So for those of you who have ever gone for a research grant and your funder says, can you explain the impacts of your research? We can live off this for a very long time. Lots of risks though. As I mentioned, litigations going on. I have been sued, threatened with suits, even as a third party in ongoing litigation right now. We're subject to discovery processes. All of this can be very stressful and expensive, hard to deal with, make you risk averse. Like it is one of those careful what you wish for sorts of things. There's a lot of disinformation around the work that we do. So these bad actors that we're outing, they're not just going to sit back and go, oh, good for Citizen Lab. They got us again. So this is hilarious. This was broadcast on primetime Polish state television a few years ago. And look at, there I am in this like mob diagram. Supposedly Russian intelligence, which is ironic because just 2 weeks ago, we published a report on a Russian cyber espionage campaign. And yeah, I'm not reporting to Julian Assange. Most serious, last one, covert ops. Famously, infamously, we were targeted by a private intelligence firm called Black Cube, made up of ex-Mossad agents. They tried to surreptitiously record conversations with my staff to try to incriminate us or discredit us. And I think they picked the wrong lab to do that to, because we teamed up with Associated Press and actually organized a sting in a Manhattan restaurant and outed this particular person who was working for Black Cube. Coincidentally, that's the same firm that targeted Ronan Farrow and was employed by Harvey Weinstein, who was going after people who alleged rape and sexual assault. So yeah, not a very pleasant company that one is. So just in terms of risk mitigation, lastly here, we think about this a lot. This is obviously very risky work. And people often ask, why aren't there more citizen labs in other universities? I think I kind of crept up from the inside of the University of Toronto, and now they, I'm not sure they know what to do with me. They have us, they like the publicity, but maybe starting from scratch and proposing to do this might not go down so well with a lot of universities. But we take it all seriously, especially the research ethics. Peer review for everything we do is essential, right? It's essential for the credibility of the evidence. President of Mexico can say it's all made up, but it's not true. Not only is it not all made up, it's evidence-based, data-driven, peer-reviewed research. Spend a lot of time with legal counsel. I have several lawyers on my staff full-time. We have U of T's, University of Toronto's counsel, plus outside counsel, plus in certain situations, counsels in other jurisdictions. And of course, there's all sorts of security protocols that we have to follow. So all of that is quite a big challenge. Anyway, that's it for me.